They told her to serve coffee because she looked like someone who belonged in the kitchen, not the briefing room. No insignia, no name tape, just a quiet woman in standard desert camouflage carrying a black folder. But when she reached across the conference table to refill the general's cup, her sleeve pulled back just enough to expose something on her finger that made every officer in that room go silent. A ring that wasn't just jewelry. It was proof of the deadliest training program in the military. The same general who'd been ignoring her suddenly couldn't take his eyes off her hand because what he saw meant she'd survived missions that most of his colonels had only read about in classified reports. The morning briefing at Joint Operations Base Pendleton was supposed to be routine. Another quarterly assessment. Another room full of senior officers discussing overseas operations while someone else handled the logistics. Someone expendable. Someone like Staff Sergeant Elena Rodriguez. She didn't look like much walking into conference room 4B that Thursday morning. Standard desert camouflage uniform. No unit patches visible. No colorful ribbons decorating her chest. Hair pulled back in a regulation ponytail. Not a strand out of place, but nothing that would catch anyone's attention either. She carried a black folder under one arm and a stainless steel carafe in the other, moving with the kind of quiet efficiency that made people assume she was exactly where she belonged, in the background, handling the details nobody else wanted to deal with. The briefing room was already buzzing with conversation when she slipped through the door. 3 full colonels clustered around the head of the table, pointing at satellite images spread across the mahogany surface. A pair of lieutenant colonels were reviewing flight manifests near the window, and at the far end, General David Morrison sat reviewing his notes with a focused intensity that had earned him 2 stars in command of Special Operations Logistics. None of them looked up when Elena entered. Why would they? She moved along the perimeter of the room, setting up the coffee station with practiced precision. Fresh filters, extra cream packets, sugar packets arranged in neat rows, the kind of mundane preparation work that kept high-level meetings running smoothly while the important people focused on important things. Elena had done this dance before in rooms just like this one for officers just like these. "Excuse me," called out Colonel Hayes from across the room, not even bothering to look at her direction. "Can you make sure we have enough copies of the operational summary and maybe some of those Danish pastries from the commissary?" Elena nodded once. "Yes, sir." "And when General Morrison arrives," added Colonel Martinez, rifling through her briefing folder, "make sure his coffee is black. No sugar. He's particular about that." "Understood, ma'am." They spoke to her the way people talk to furniture. Functional, necessary, but not quite human. Elena had heard that tone before, felt those dismissive glances that looked right through her like she was part of the administrative machinery that kept the military bureaucracy humming along. Another enlisted soldier handling the grunt work while the real decision-makers focused on strategy. What none of them knew, what none of them could have guessed from looking at her unremarkable uniform and quiet demeanor, was that Elena Rodriguez had spent the last 18 months doing things that would give most of them nightmares. But that revelation was still 20 minutes away. For now, she was just the coffee girl, invisible and forgettable, exactly the way she preferred it. Elena had learned long ago that being underestimated was often the most powerful weapon in any arsenal. People told you things when they thought you didn't matter. They let their guard down when they assumed you were no threat. It was intelligence gathering of the most basic kind, and Elena had turned it into an art form. Her background was deliberately unremarkable on paper. Standard enlisted progression through the ranks, clean service record, competent but not exceptional performance reviews. The kind of military career that would never draw scrutiny from personnel reviewers or raise questions during security clearance investigations. Everything about Staff Sergeant Elena Rodriguez suggested she was exactly what she appeared to be, a reliable, competent, utterly forgettable cog in the vast machinery of military logistics. But that was precisely the point. Most mornings, Elena could be found in the administrative offices of Building 315, handling requisitions and coordinating schedules for senior staff meetings. She knew which general preferred his briefings on paper versus digital displays, which colonel needed extra time to review operational summaries, in which officers could be counted on to show up late and need their materials reorganized on the fly. She was the person who made sure the coffee was fresh, the conference rooms were properly equipped, and the classified documents were distributed to the right people with the right security clearances. It was the kind of work that kept military bureaucracy functioning smoothly while remaining completely invisible to the people who benefited from it. Elena liked it that way. Being essential but unnoticed gave her access to information and meetings that most people at her rank would never see. She could observe decision-making processes, understand command relationships, and maintain situational awareness without anyone questioning why she was always around when important conversations were happening. Today was different, though. Today, she was filling in for Master Sergeant Williams, who'd called in sick with what sounded like the flu over the phone. That meant Elena was handling logistics for a briefing that was several pay grades above her usual assignments. Joint operations planning, classified mission reviews, the kind of meeting where colonels and generals discuss things that never made it into official reports. She'd arrived early to set everything up properly, checked the secure communications equipment, arranged the seating chart according to rank and security clearance, made sure all the classified materials were properly accounted for and locked in the appropriate safes until the meeting began. By the time the first officers started arriving, everything was in perfect order, and Elena had positioned herself exactly where she needed to be to remain useful, but unnoticed. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, preparing to serve coffee and take notes for a room full of officers planning operations she knew more about than they realized. But that was the game she'd chosen to play, and she'd gotten very good at it over the years. Being underestimated had served her well in situations far more dangerous than a Pentagon briefing room. Elena straightened the last of the coffee cups and glanced at her watch. General Morrison would be arriving in 15 minutes, and she wanted everything perfect when he walked through that door. Not because she was trying to impress him, but because attention to detail was a habit that had kept her alive in places where mistakes had permanent consequences. She checked her uniform one more time, making sure everything was in place, then took her position near the back wall, where she could monitor the meeting without drawing attention to herself. In a few minutes, she'd become part of the furniture again, invisible and essential, exactly the way she preferred it. General David Morrison arrived exactly on schedule, which was 15 minutes early. You could hear him coming down the corridor before you saw him, not because he was loud, but because everything about the man commanded attention. Sharp uniform, with every ribbon and medal positioned with mathematical precision. Silver eagles gleaming under the fluorescent lights, and that particular way of walking that suggested he'd never encountered a problem he couldn't solve with superior firepower and tactical thinking. He was the kind of general who'd earned his stars through field commands, not Pentagon politics. 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq, and enough classified operations that his official biography read like a heavily redacted document. The rumors said he'd personally led special operations missions that most people would only hear about in Hollywood movies, but Morrison never talked about those days. He didn't need to. Everything about his bearing suggested a man who'd seen combat and come out the other side with his principles intact. When he walked in a conference room, 4B, the entire energy of the space shifted. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Officers straightened in their chairs, and everyone suddenly looked like they were trying to appear more competent than they'd been 30 seconds earlier. Morrison had that effect on people, not through intimidation exactly, but through the kind of quiet authority that came from having made life and death decisions under pressure. He surveyed the room with the methodical attention of someone conducting a tactical assessment. His eyes swept across the satellite photos, the classified briefing materials, the assembled staff officers, taking inventory of everything and everyone present. When his gaze passed over Elena, standing quietly near the coffee station, it didn't linger. She was part of the background, exactly where she belonged in his mental map of the meeting space. General Morrison took his seat at the head of the table and opened his briefing folder with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested he'd been attending meetings like this one for longer than most of the other officers had been in the military. He was the senior man in the room, the final decision-maker, the person everyone else would defer to when it came time to approve or reject the operational plans they were about to discuss. "Gentlemen, ladies," Morrison said, his voice carrying easily across the room without being raised. "Let's begin." Colonel Hayes immediately launched into the operational overview, using a laser pointer to highlight key positions on the satellite imagery spread across the conference table. The mission parameters were classified, but the general framework was familiar enough. Joint operations planning, coordination between different service branches, the kind of complex logistical challenge that required input from multiple commands and careful attention to political sensitivities. Elena listened with the detached professionalism of someone whose job was to take notes and handle administrative details. She understood more of the tactical discussion than anyone in the room would have expected, but her role was to remain invisible while ensuring the meeting ran smoothly. That meant keeping the coffee fresh, monitoring the classified documents, and being ready to handle any logistical issues that might arise. General Morrison asked pointed questions about force deployment timelines and communications protocols. Colonel Martinez provided detailed assessments of intelligence requirements and operational security concerns. The conversation moved with the kind of focused intensity that suggested everyone present understood the stakes involved in whatever operation they were planning. 25 minutes into the briefing, Morrison glanced toward the coffee station and caught Elena's eye with a slight nod. She understood immediately, moving forward with the stainless steel carafe to refresh his cup. It was a routine interaction, the kind of small service that happened dozens of times in meetings like this one. Elena approached the conference table professionally, waiting for a brief pause in the conversation before stepping forward to refill the general's coffee. She'd done this hundreds of times before in similar meetings, moving efficiently around senior officers without disrupting the flow of important discussions. But this time will be different. This time, something as simple as reaching across a conference table would change everything about how everyone in that room saw Staff Sergeant Elena Rodriguez. She just didn't know it yet. The moment General Morrison nodded toward his coffee cup, Elena moved forward with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd served in countless briefings just like this one. She approached the conference table during a natural pause in the discussion, stainless steel carafe in hand, ready to top off his cup without disrupting the flow of important tactical planning. Colonel Hayes was in the middle of explaining force deployment schedules when Elena stepped up beside General Morrison's chair. She could hear Colonel Martinez asking questions about intelligence coordination from across the table, but her focus was on the simple task at hand. Pour the coffee, step back, remain invisible. Morrison barely acknowledged her presence as she leaned forward to reach his cup. This was routine military courtesy, the kind of small service that happened automatically in senior staff meetings. He continued reviewing the operational timeline spread across the table in front of him, his attention completely focused on the classified mission parameters Colonel Hayes was outlining. Elena lifted the stainless steel carafe and began pouring fresh coffee into Morrison's cup, her movement smooth and professional. She'd done this exact same action hundreds of times before in meetings just like this one for officers just like him. There was nothing different about today, nothing special about this particular moment that should have drawn anyone's attention. But as she reached across the table to avoid spilling coffee on the classified documents, her uniform sleeve pulled back slightly, exposing her left hand more fully than usual. It was a minor wardrobe adjustment, the kind of thing that happens when you're stretching to reach something while trying to be careful about where you're pouring hot liquid. The movement was so subtle that most people wouldn't have noticed it at all. Colonel Hayes was still talking about deployment schedules. Colonel Martinez was taking notes on intelligence requirements. The other officers were focused on operational timelines and logistical challenges. None of them noticed that their commanding general had just gone completely silent. Morrison's eyes locked onto Elena's left hand, specifically onto the ring that adorned her fourth finger. It wasn't a wedding band or a class ring or any of the typical jewelry that military personnel might wear. It was something far more significant, far more exclusive. The ring was crafted from blackened steel with a distinctive trident design etched into its surface. 3 prongs rising from waves, surrounded by an anchor and eagle. It was understated, almost plain to the untrained eye, but to someone with Morrison's background, it might as well have been a neon sign. It was a Navy SEAL ring. Not a replica, not a knockoff, but the real thing. The kind that could only be earned through successful completion of basic underwater demolition SEAL training, one of the most grueling and selective programs in the entire United States military. The kind that represented months of physical and mental torture designed to break all but the most exceptional candidates. The kind that fewer than 1 in 4 people who started the program would ever earn the right to wear. Morrison's mind raced through everything he knew about Navy SEAL training and the women who'd attempted it over the years. The numbers were brutal. Out of thousands of candidates who started the program, only a tiny percentage made it through to graduation. And among women who'd attempted the course, the success rate was even more devastating. He could count on one hand the number of women who'd earned the right to wear that ring. Elena stepped back from the table, professional and efficient as always, ready to return to her position near the back wall. But Morrison's eyes followed her movement now, seeing details that had been invisible to him just moments before. The way she balanced on the balls of her feet, ready to move in any direction. The way her free hand remained relaxed, but positioned where she could react quickly if needed. The way her eyes briefly scanned the room's exits before settling back into a neutral expression. These weren't the habits of a staff sergeant who'd spent her career handling administrative duties. These were the instincts of someone who'd been trained to survive in hostile environments where a moment's inattention could be fatal. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Morrison said quietly, his voice cutting through Colonel Hayes's presentation like a knife. The entire room went silent. Every officer at the table turned to look at their commanding general, then followed his gaze to Elena, who had frozen near the coffee station with the stainless steel carafe still in her hands. "Sir," Elena responded, her voice steady and professional. But Morrison could see something change in her posture. A subtle shift that suggested she knew something significant had just happened, even if she wasn't sure exactly what it was. Morrison set his coffee cup down carefully, never taking his eyes off her face. "That's an interesting ring you're wearing." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Colonel Hayes looked confused, glancing between his commanding general and the staff sergeant who was supposed to be handling refreshments. Colonel Martinez stopped taking notes entirely, her pen hovering over the legal pad as she tried to understand what was happening. Elena glanced down at her left hand, and Morrison saw the exact moment she realized her cover had been blown. Her expression didn't change dramatically, but there was a slight tightening around her eyes that suggested she was rapidly calculating her options and coming up short. "It was a gift, sir," she said carefully, which was technically true, but completely inadequate as an explanation. Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying her with the kind of intense focus he usually reserved for enemy positions he was planning to attack. From whom? The question hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Everyone in the room was now staring at Elena, waiting for an answer that would explain why their commanding general had suddenly become fascinated with a staff sergeant's jewelry. But Morrison already knew the answer, and he suspected Elena knew that he knew. The only question now was whether she was going to continue pretending to be someone she wasn't, or if she was finally going to reveal who Staff Sergeant Elena Rodriguez really was beneath that carefully constructed facade of administrative competence. The silence stretched out until it became uncomfortable, filled with the kind of tension that suggested everyone present understood they were witnessing something important, even if they didn't fully understand what it was yet. Elena Rodriguez had been in worse situations than this, much worse. She'd been pinned down by enemy fire in Helmand Province with nothing but a sidearm and a wounded teammate who couldn't move. She'd infiltrated terrorist compounds where discovery meant torture and death. She'd completed underwater demolition exercises in conditions that would have killed most people before they'd even started. But standing in Conference Room 4B at Joint Operations Base Pendleton, holding a stainless steel carafe while a room full of senior officers stared at her felt like one of the most dangerous moments of her recent career. Not because her life was in immediate physical danger, but because everything she'd worked to build over the past 18 months was about to come crashing down. The administrative cover story was carefully constructed for good reasons. After her last deployment, after everything that had happened in Syria, the Navy had decided that Staff Sergeant Elena Rodriguez needed to disappear for a while. Not permanently, just long enough for certain situations to cool down and for her to recover from injuries that didn't appear on any official medical records. So they buried her real service record under layers of bureaucratic paperwork and assigned her to the most boring, unremarkable position they could find. Administrative support at a Joint Command base, handling logistics for senior staff meetings, filing reports that nobody would ever read twice. It was supposed to be temporary rehabilitation duty, disguised as a routine assignment. The problem with being exceptionally good at staying invisible was that eventually someone always noticed. Elena looked directly at General Morrison, making the tactical decision that honesty was now her only viable option. She could continue the charade, claim the ring was a family heirloom, or some other convenient lie. But Morrison's expression told her he wouldn't accept anything less than the truth. And if she was being honest with herself, she was tired of pretending to be someone she wasn't. "The ring was earned, sir," she said quietly. The words fell into the silence like grenades with their pins pulled. Colonel Hayes actually dropped his pen. Colonel Martinez's mouth opened slightly, then closed without making a sound. The other officers around the table looked like they were trying to process information that didn't fit with anything they thought they knew about the world. General Morrison nodded slowly, as if Elena had just confirmed something he'd already suspected. "When did you graduate, Buds?" he asked. "Class 347, sir. 3 years ago." Morrison did the math in his head, cross-referencing dates and class numbers with what he knew about the SEAL training pipeline. Class 347 would have been one of the first classes to include women candidates, part of the military's gradual integration of combat roles. It would also have been one of the most scrutinized training cycles in SEAL history, with everyone watching to see if female candidates could meet the same impossible standards that have been breaking men for decades. Hell Week completed successfully, sir, along with all other phases of training. The room remained absolutely silent. Nobody moved, nobody spoke, nobody even seemed to be breathing normally. The revelation that their coffee-serving staff sergeant was actually a SEAL had fundamentally altered everyone's understanding of reality. It was like discovering that the janitor was actually a brain surgeon or that the secretary was a former CIA operative, which Elena reflected grimly wasn't that far from the truth. General Morrison studied her face with the kind of intense scrutiny usually reserved for enemy combatants during interrogation. "What's your actual assignment here, Staff Sergeant?" Elena hesitated for just a moment, calculating how much she could reveal without compromising operational security or her current mission parameters. The truth was complicated, involving classified medical issues and ongoing investigations that she wasn't authorized to discuss with anyone below a certain clearance level. "Recovery assignment, sir. Temporary administrative duty while awaiting reassignment to operational status." It was the sanitized version of the truth, stripped of all the details that would have required security briefings and classified documentation. But it was accurate enough to satisfy Morrison's immediate questions without revealing information that could compromise ongoing operations. General Morrison leaned forward in his chair, his coffee forgotten, as he processed what Elena had just revealed. Recovery assignment meant she'd been wounded in action, probably seriously enough to require extended rehabilitation. Temporary administrative duty was military code for keeping valuable personnel safe while they healed from things that couldn't be discussed in polite company. "What was your last operational assignment?" Morrison asked, his voice taking on the tone of a commanding officer conducting a formal debriefing. "Sir, I'm not sure this is the appropriate venue for that discussion," Elena said carefully. She was walking a tightrope between military protocol and operational security, trying to satisfy Morrison's curiosity without revealing classified information to people who didn't have the proper clearance levels. Morrison understood immediately. Whatever Elena's last mission had been, it was classified at a level that excluded most of the officers currently present. He made a quick decision, the kind of command judgment that separated effective leaders from bureaucrats who followed procedure manuals. "Colonel Hayes, Colonel Martinez, I need you to step outside for a few minutes." Hayes started to protest. "Sir, we're in the middle of operational planning." "Now, Colonel." Morrison's voice carried the kind of authority that didn't allow for discussion or delay. The two colonels exchanged glances, clearly frustrated at being excluded from what had become the most interesting briefing either of them had attended in months. But orders were orders, and General Morrison outranked everyone in the room by a considerable margin. They gathered their materials and filed out of the conference room, leaving Morrison alone with Elena and the lingering smell of fresh coffee. The door clicked shut with a finality that seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet room. Morrison waited until he was certain they were completely alone before continuing his questioning. "Now," he said, settling back in his chair, "what really happened in Syria?" Elena felt her carefully constructed composure crack slightly. Syria wasn't supposed to be common knowledge. The operations she'd been involved in there were buried under so many layers of classification that most people with general-level security clearances would never see the reports. The fact that Morrison knew about Syria meant he had access to intelligence briefings that went well beyond routine joint operations planning. "How do you know about Syria, sir?" Morrison smiled grimly. "Because I read the after-action reports, all of them, including the ones with your name redacted, but your operational signature all over them." Elena realized she'd been outmaneuvered by someone who'd done his homework more thoroughly than she'd anticipated. Morrison wasn't just asking random questions about her background. He knew exactly who she was and what she'd been doing before her assignment to Pendleton. The only question was how much he knew about the things that had gone wrong. "The hostage extraction mission, sir. 3 American contractors taken by ISIS affiliates. Intel suggested they were being held in a compound outside Aleppo." Morrison nodded. "Mission success. All 3 hostages recovered alive. Minimal casualties on our side." He paused, studying her face. But something went wrong after the primary objective was completed. Elena's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The successful hostage rescue was the part of the mission that had made it into official reports and commendation recommendations. What happened afterward was the part that landed her in a military hospital for 6 weeks and eventually led to her current assignment serving coffee at staff meetings. "Secondary explosion, sir. IED concealed in the extraction route. Hit our convoy about 2 clicks from the compound. Your team leader was killed," Morrison said, though it wasn't really a question. "Master Chief Rodriguez, along with Petty Officer Jenkins and Petty Officer Walsh. I was the only survivor from the primary assault team." Morrison had read the classified reports about that mission. He knew that Elena had been trapped under debris for nearly 4 hours before rescue teams could extract her. He knew about the shrapnel that had come within millimeters of severing her spinal cord and the internal injuries that required multiple surgeries to repair. What the reports couldn't convey was the psychological impact of losing an entire team and surviving when better soldiers hadn't. "How long were you hospitalized?" Morrison asked gently. 6 weeks active treatment, another 2 months of physical therapy. Elena met his eyes directly, but the doctors cleared me for full operational duty. The assignment here is just temporary until command decides where to place me next. General Morrison sat back in his chair, processing everything Elena had just revealed. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place now, creating a picture that was both impressive and heartbreaking. Here was a woman who'd survived the most brutal training program in the military, completed classified combat missions that most people would never hear about, and lost her entire team in an operation that would still be classified as successful because the primary objectives had been achieved. And for the past 18 months, she'd been serving coffee and filing paperwork because the Navy didn't know what else to do with a hero who'd been too broken to fight, but too valuable to discharge. The medical reports Morrison said carefully. Are they accurate? Elena understood what he was really asking. Military medical evaluations after traumatic injuries were notorious for their conservative assessments. Doctors erred on the side of caution, keeping valuable personnel in non-combat roles longer than might be strictly necessary. But they also sometimes missed subtle indicators that suggested someone wasn't quite ready to return to operational status, regardless of what the physical examinations revealed. Physically, I'm ready, Elena said. All the injuries healed properly. Range of motion is back to 100%. Strength and endurance are actually better than pre-deployment levels. Morrison heard what she wasn't saying in the careful way she'd phrased her response. And psychologically, Elena was quiet for a long moment, staring at the conference table where classified operational plans were still spread across the mahogany surface. She had been avoiding this conversation for months, deflecting questions from military psychologists and command staff who wanted to know if she was ready to return to active duty. The truth was complicated in ways that didn't fit neatly into medical evaluation forms. I dream about them, she said finally. Rodriguez, Jenkins, Walsh. Not nightmares exactly, just dreams where they're still alive and we're planning the next mission. I wake up expecting to see them in the team room, and then I remember they're not coming back. Morrison understood completely. He'd lost good people under his command over the years, knew the weight of survivor's guilt, and how it could eat away at even the strongest soldiers. The fact that Elena was still dealing with psychological aftermath from Syria didn't make her weak. If anything, it proved she'd cared deeply about her teammates and understood the true cost of military operations. Have you talked to anyone about it professionally? I mean, Navy psychologists, chaplain, even tried civilian therapy for a while. They all say the same thing. It's a normal grief response for combat veterans. Give it time. Stay active. Don't isolate yourself. Eventually, the dreams will fade and I'll be ready to move forward. But you don't feel ready. I don't know, Elena admitted. Some days I wake up and I'm angry that I'm stuck here handling administrative duties when I should be out there doing the job I was trained for. Other days, I think about the responsibility of leading another team, knowing that my decisions could get them killed. And I wonder if I've lost the edge that kept us all alive for so long. Morrison understood completely. Command responsibility was a burden that few people could carry effectively, and even fewer could carry it twice after losing people the first time. The fact that Elena was still questioning her readiness was actually a good sign. Overconfident operators were dangerous to everyone around them. What do you want? Morrison asked. Not what the Navy wants, not what the doctors recommend, not what looks good on your service record, but what do you actually want to do? Elena looked up at him with surprise. Nobody had asked her that question in months. Everyone had been focused on her medical status, her psychological evaluation scores, her fitness for duty assessments, but nobody had simply asked her what she wanted her future to look like. I want to get back to doing the job I'm good at, Elena said without hesitation. Not because I'm running away from what happened in Syria, but because I know I can still make a difference. The skills are still there. The training is still solid. I just need the right opportunity to prove that I'm ready. Morrison studied her face, looking for any sign of uncertainty or false bravado. What he saw was someone who'd been honest about her limitations, but was ready to move beyond them. Someone who understood the cost of leadership, but was willing to accept that responsibility again. What if I told you I might have that opportunity? Morrison said. Elena felt something shift inside her chest, like a gear that had been stuck finally clicking into place. For the first time in 18 months, she was having a conversation about her future instead of her past. General Morrison wasn't looking at her like she was damaged goods or a liability waiting to happen. He was looking at her like she was exactly what he needed for something important. What kind of opportunity, sir? She asked, keeping her voice steady despite the surge of hope she felt rising in her throat. Morrison glanced toward the door, making sure they were still alone, then turned back to face her. The operational planning we were discussing before this conversation started. Joint Special Operations, classified mission parameters, the kind of work that requires someone with very specific skill sets. Elena's pulse quickened. Real operational planning meant real missions, not administrative support or training exercises. It meant the chance to do the job she had been trained for instead of serving coffee and filing reports for people who were planning missions she should have been leading. I can't give you details here, Morrison continued. The security clearance requirements alone would take weeks to process, but I can tell you that we're looking for experienced operators who can handle complex tactical situations with minimal support structure. People who've proven they can make good decisions under pressure and adapt when things go sideways. Which they always do, Elena said, and Morrison smiled slightly at her response. Which they always do, he agreed. The question is whether you're ready for that level of responsibility again. Not whether the doctors think you're ready, not whether your evaluation scores suggest you're ready, but whether you know deep down that you can handle leading people into situations where your decisions determine whether they come home alive. It was the question Elena had been avoiding for months, the one that had kept her awake during those dreams about Rodriguez and Jenkins and Walsh. She had been carrying the weight of their deaths like a stone in her chest, afraid that accepting another leadership role would be dishonoring their memory somehow, as if moving forward meant forgetting them or minimizing the significance of their sacrifice. But sitting in that conference room, looking at General Morrison's expectant face, she realized she'd been thinking about it all wrong. Rodriguez had been the one who'd recommended her for SEAL training in the first place. Jenkins and Walsh had followed her leadership through a dozen successful missions before the one that went bad. They hadn't died because she'd made poor decisions. They died because war was unpredictable and dangerous. And sometimes good people didn't make it home despite everyone doing everything right. I'm ready, Elena said. And for the first time in 18 months, she actually meant it. Morrison studied her face for a long moment, looking for any sign of uncertainty or false confidence. What he saw was someone who'd worked through her doubts and come out stronger on the other side. Someone who understood the weight of command responsibility, but was willing to carry it again because it was the right thing to do. The assignment would be temporary initially, 60 days, maybe 90, depending on how the operational timeline develops. If everything goes well, it could lead to permanent reassignment to an active special operations unit. If it doesn't go well, he shrugged. You'd probably end up back here serving coffee. Elena almost smiled at that. After everything she'd been through, the prospect of returning to administrative duty seemed like the least of her concerns. When would it start? That depends on how quickly we can get your security clearances updated and your medical records transferred. A couple of weeks if we push the paperwork through the right channels. There's one more thing, though. The mission parameters require someone who can blend in, operate without obvious military identification, someone who's good at being invisible. Like serving coffee at briefings where nobody pays attention to the staff sergeant in the corner. Exactly like that. Morrison stood up from his chair, extending his hand toward her. Welcome back to operational status, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez. Elena shook his hand firmly, feeling like she was finally stepping back into the life she'd been meant to live. The past 18 months hadn't been wasted time after all. They'd been preparation for whatever came next, teaching her skills she hadn't even realized she was learning. Thank you, sir. You won't regret this decision. I know I won't. The question is whether Colonels Hayes and Martinez are going to regret underestimating you when they find out what just happened in here. When General Morrison opened the conference room door to call Colonels Hayes and Martinez back inside, the atmosphere had completely changed. What had been a routine operational briefing was now something else entirely. Though neither colonel could quite put their finger on what had shifted during their forced absence. Elena was still standing near the coffee station, stainless steel carafe in hand, but something about her posture had changed. She no longer looked like someone trying to blend into the background. Instead, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged wherever she happened to be standing. "Gentlemen, please take your seats," Morrison said, though his tone suggested this was no longer the same meeting they'd been attending 20 minutes earlier. "We need to make some adjustments to our operational planning." Colonel Hayes settled back into his chair with obvious frustration. "Sir, we still have deployment schedules to review and logistics coordination to finalize. Whatever personnel matter you needed to discuss with the staff sergeant, perhaps we could handle it after the briefing." Morrison exchanged a glance with Elena, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. They'd reached an understanding during their private conversation, but now came the delicate task of managing the fallout without compromising operational security or unnecessarily humiliating officers who'd simply made incorrect assumptions. Actually, Colonel, the personnel matter is directly related to our operational planning. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez won't be handling administrative support for this briefing much longer. Colonel Martinez looked confused. Is she being reassigned? Because we're going to need someone to coordinate the logistics for Staff Sergeant Rodriguez. We'll be coordinating logistics from an operational planning perspective rather than an administrative support role. The two colonels exchanged puzzled glances. The distinction Morrison was making didn't seem particularly significant to them. Administrative support, operational planning, logistics coordination. It all sounded like variations on the same basic staff work that enlisted personnel handled while officers focused on strategic decision-making. Elena stepped forward slightly, no longer content to remain invisible in the background. With General Morrison's permission, I'd like to clarify my role in the upcoming mission planning. Go ahead, Staff Sergeant. My specialty is unconventional warfare and direct action operations. I've completed 16 operational deployments across multiple theaters, including classified missions in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. My most recent assignment was team leader for a hostage extraction operation that successfully recovered 3 American contractors from an ISIS affiliate compound. Colonel Hayes stared at her like she'd just announced she was secretly an astronaut. Staff Sergeant, that's not what your personnel file indicates. My personnel file reflects my current assignment, not my operational history. For security reasons, certain aspects of my background have been classified at levels that don't typically appear in routine administrative records. Colonel Martinez was frantically flipping through the briefing materials in front of her, looking for some indication that she'd missed crucial information about the woman who had been serving their coffee for the past hour. General Morrison, I don't understand. If Staff Sergeant Rodriguez has special operations experience, why wasn't that included in our mission planning from the beginning? Because sometimes the most valuable intelligence comes from observing how people react when they think nobody important is watching. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez has been conducting an informal assessment of our operational security protocols while handling what appeared to be routine administrative duties. The implications of that statement hit both colonels simultaneously. For the past hour, they've been discussing classified mission parameters in front of someone they assumed was just administrative support. They'd made assumptions about security clearances, need-to-know requirements, and operational compartmentalization based on nothing more than uniform appearance and job assignment. What did you observe, Staff Sergeant? Elena glanced at the colonels, then back at the general. Several potential security concerns, sir. Nothing that can't be addressed with proper protocol adjustments, but definitely issues that should be reviewed before operational deployment. The balance of power in the room had shifted completely, and everyone present was beginning to realize it. Respect earned in silence lasts longer than applause.